Today I've come to the location where one of Russia's most prominent writers was fatally wounded during a duel. During the mid-1800s, dueling was popular in many parts of the world, and Russia was no exception. In fact, it was the main way of settling any dispute between the nobility. This plaque here marks the spot where Pushkin received his fatal shot. There's many different kinds of duels, and the one favoured in Russia was the one whereby the participants stood at a certain distance away from each other and basically shot each other one at a time. In those days it was quite common for the guns to get stuck, so that's why they didn't shoot each other at the same time, because it'd be considered inappropriate to shoot someone, and if when they were shooting you back their gun got stuck, it'd be like a not a very satisfactory victory and a bit ungentlemanly as well. So that's why they decided to shoot each other one at a time. Now obviously that gives ever such a slight advantage to the person that shoots first, doesn't it? And that proved to be the case here, because Pushkin's rival shot him first, and then as he was wounded pretty badly, he then obviously wasn't able to do his best shot back, and then he only caused his opponent a light injury. Really the point of the duels was just to restore honour. You weren't necessarily supposed to kill the person you're duelling with. Duelling was outlawed, it wasn't allowed, but certainly it was such a big part of the culture that it seems a blind eye was turned to it, and it was very common. And in fact, Pushkin wasn't the only high-profile person who lost his life in the duel. A few years later, one of Russia's other best writers, Lermontov, also lost his life in a duel at the age of just 26. I mean, a terrible waste of a life. I mean, Pushkin himself was only in his early 30s. In fairness, due to the fact that Pushkin and Lermontov died in duels, I think that's one reason why they're now considered, Russia's greatest writers, because people take into account the fact that they died young. If either of them had just died an old man in their bed, would they now be considered Russia's greatest writers? So Pushkin's widely regarded as Russia's most prominent poet and writer. But really, how do we know that? Well, we know that is because, everyone, their parents and their teachers tell them. Well, how do they know that? Well, that's because their parents and their teachers told them, and their parents and their teachers told them before that, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit like Shakespeare, isn't it? Has there really not been a better writer in the past 600 years, British writer? In Russia it's particularly difficult to know who's the greatest writer type thing, because all the censorship that's always been in Russia, from the Tsarist times through to the Soviet times. In fact, during the Soviet period, Pushkin was promoted quite a lot. Pushkin's writing, I think, sometimes was kind of a bit anti-Tsarist, so that's clearly made him popular during the Soviet period. No matter how good Pushkin's work was, if it was pro-Tsarist, do you think the Soviets would have put all statues to him everywhere, named parks and towns after and everything like that? No, obviously not. Would have never have heard of him. So I mean, it's as always, it's just all down to politics, isn't it? And I think the fact that Pushkin was promoted so much during the Soviet period, that's why he's nowhere near as well known internationally as he is in Russia, or as perhaps other Russian writers are known. Because a lot of people internationally, they don't even know Pushkin, which is probably surprising for Russian people. This place was clearly chosen for its out-of-the-way location. I mean, even now, getting on for almost 200 years later, it still feels pretty remote here. So at the time, this would have been really in the middle of nowhere. Dueling was such a massive part of the culture at the time, both Lermontov and Pushkin wrote about it a lot. And both of them had first-hand experience. I mean, Pushkin took part, I think, in about almost 30 duels. Like I say, he weren't really meant to die in them, I don't think. It was kind of just a way to restore some honour, if someone feels they're being offended in some way. And I think a lot of the time it was just a perceived grievance as opposed to a real one. I guess in Pushkin's case, the reason he was able to come away unscathed from so many duels was because he was a famous poet, and this was back in the day when poets were like human gods. So I guess nobody wanted to kill their country's best poet and take the consequences of that. So maybe in the end he's just got to be complacent. But really, of course, if you're going to play with fire often enough, then sooner or later you will get burned. Most of the nobility in Russia lived here in St Petersburg. It was the capital city at the time, so we shouldn't be surprised to learn that most of the duels also took place here. And not that far away from where Pushkin died, there was another duel that took place in this forest here. What's interesting here is that they've actually marked the places where they stood off and shot at each other. One stood there and the other stood there. So you see, I mean, it's not that far away really. So there's a good chance that you would actually hit your opponent, and of course in many cases fatally wound him. It seems a willful and wasteful loss of life, doesn't it? All these young men just taking part in kind of not a game, but it was almost like that, with fatal consequences. But I guess you have to try to remember how things were at the time.